Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Future Speaker Series at Humboldt State University. My name is Deepti Chatti and I'm an Assistant Professor of Environmental Justice at Humboldt State. Before we begin today's event, I will spend a couple of minutes telling you about the Sustainable Future Speaker Series, give you some information about two upcoming talks this semester, provide some housekeeping information about today's talk, and introduce our esteemed speaker. Since 2005, the Sustainable Future Speaker Series has brought exciting research talks to HSU campus and has stimulated interdisciplinary conversations around energy, the environment, and society. In the time of the COVID pandemic, we have luckily been able to continue the speaker series in a virtual format, and the silver lining of this being that we can open up our talks to interested audiences from anywhere in the world. All events are free and open to the public and are co-sponsored by the Schatz Energy Research Center, the Environment and Community Graduate Program, and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Humboldt State University in California. We have two more talks coming up this fall. Next Thursday, November 5th, Dr. Nithya Ramanathan will discuss data-driven public health design for underserved communities and will share her experiences in scaling NextLeaf's cold trace solution, which has been deployed in 23 countries and now protects the vaccine supply for 1 in 10 babies born on Earth. We'll close the season on November 12th with Dr. Lina Dallas-Shea, who's an associate professor of history here at Humboldt State, who will speak about holy waters and the colonial control of land, space, and resources in Palestine. For the latest information and registration instructions, please go to the Schatz Center website and the Environment and Community Department website. My colleague, Maya Kelly, will post those links in the chat for you. Thank you, Maya. Now moving on to a couple of housekeeping announcements. This presentation will be followed by a brief question and answer session with our speaker, Dr. Lennon. If you'd like to ask a question of today's speaker, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. On the other hand, if you have any technical difficulties, please post them to the chat box, and my colleague Maya Kelly will try to help you resolve the problem. So for the Q&A session questions, go to the Q&A box, and for tech difficulties, the chat box. Okay, now moving on to more fun things. It is such a delight for me to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Myles Lennon is an environmental anthropologist, the Dean's Assistant Professor of Environment and Society and Anthropology at Brown University, and a former sustainable energy policy practitioner. His research explores how rooftop solar, resiliency microgrids, and other climate mitigation infrastructures simultaneously reinforce and upend entrenched structures of power as they materialize across long-standing race and class divisions in New York City. Dr. Lennon's research has been supported by the US National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Wenner-Gren Foundation. Dr. Lennon's scholarly and teaching interests include the anthropology of energy, environmental intersectionality, and the co-production of race and nature, multi-species ethnography, climate justice and environmental justice, science and technology studies, affect theory, and the epistemological politics of climate mitigation efforts. He holds a BA in development studies from Brown University and a PhD in environmental anthropology from Yale University. His research and scholarly objectives are informed by his experience as a sustainable energy practitioner and advocate in New York for 8 years prior to beginning his PhD. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Lennon to Humboldt State University, not only because he is a brilliant and esteemed colleague who is doing cutting-edge work on energy, but also because he happens to be a dear friend of mine from graduate school. Myles, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today, and we are all so excited to learn about your work and hear your talk. Thank you for coming here. Without further ado, let's all welcome Dr. Myles Lennon.
Thank you so much, Deepti. I really appreciate the warm welcome. And hello and good evening from the occupied homeland of the Narragansett people, a place that most of us know as Providence, Rhode Island. I just want to start off again with a hearty thank you to Deepti, Amin, and everyone at the Schatz Center for having me here this evening. I really appreciate it. So I got a lot to say, so I'm just going to jump right in it. So this April, when things were looking really bad with COVID, the New York Times reported that people were more than ever looking for uplifting content on the internet, something to feel good about amidst so much malady. And appropriately enough, Michael Moore decided it would be the perfect time to release this documentary he executive produced on YouTube called Planet of the Humans. As luck would have it, though, Planet of the Humans was not the inspiring content that people were hoping for. In fact, Planet unsparingly criticized maybe the one thing that a lot of us have really invested our hopes and dreams in, that is renewable energy. Drawing from outdated, misleading data, the film hyperbolically depicts some of the very real problems with solar and wind technologies, and it suggests that we got to curb human population growth instead of fetishizing energy transitions if we wish to address climate change. This Neo-Malthusian argument felt like the complete opposite of the prevailing sentiment of that moment. That is, that we must actively save human lives imperiled by an unprecedented pandemic. Nonetheless, this argument was in some respects the perfect complement to the "we're all in this together," the feel-good meta-narrative of the early COVID era. Because the suggestion that all humans are similarly impacted by the pandemic, and the suggestion that all humans are equally responsible for environmental collapse, overlook racial, geographical, socioeconomic, and colonial inequalities. These concepts then endorse a universal humanism that is insufficient for addressing the inequitable fallout of intersecting environmental and epidemiological problems. Because low-income and poor communities of color are both more likely to contract and die from COVID-19 and more vulnerable to the destructive environmental impacts of climate change, while white and wealthy populations in the global north bear most of the historical responsibility for the systems of extraction and development that spurred an era of epidemics and rapid ecosystem collapse. That said, Planet of the Humans rightfully looks skeptically at some of the repressive optimism that people employ to deal with global challenges like a pandemic and climate change. In contrast to the idea that everything will be all right when we develop new technology like a COVID vaccine, the film attempts to do the really important work of challenging techno-fixes. And toward this end, it dramatically overstates, but calls attention to some of the overlooked downsides of renewables, such as extractive and exploitative supply chains, destructive land use patterns, and intermittency problems. To more felicitously tend to these downsides, it would behoove us to ditch the insidiously racist population control ideas that the film offers, and instead take our lead from the anti-racist activism that the pandemic fanned like wildfires, that is, the movement for Black lives. For it is no coincidence that worldwide protests against systemic racism occurred not only in response to the most recent high-profile murders of unarmed Black people, but also during COVID-19, as heightened race and class inequalities, health inequalities, shelter-in-place orders, and a political moment dominated by crisis exacerbated long-standing frustrations with structural injustices and generated the sense of urgency that sparked mass action. The protests then are a powerful reminder that systemic racism is inextricable from global problems. Such linkages are exemplified not only by the higher rates of COVID-19 infections and deaths in communities of color, but also by the fact that this vulnerability is directly attributable to respiratory and cardiovascular conditions caused by these communities' proximity to fossil fuel infrastructures, that is, refineries and power plants and highways. Put differently, the pandemic's racialized geography of precarity is imbricated in our broader energy and climate challenges. Therefore, if we wish to act on planet's critiques and address climate change by confronting the technological limitations of renewable energy technologies in this moment of intersecting precarities, we must reject the film's race-blind interrogation of humanity writ large and instead train an anti-racist lens on renewable energy production. As the recent protests demonstrate, this anti-racist work need not entail starting a new movement, and instead must build on the long-standing movements against white supremacy that have only grown as of late. Toward this end, today I'm going to offer a framework for confronting the racial inequalities of renewable energy supply chains through the anti-racist energy democracy movement in the United States. This movement draws its strength from on-the-ground organizing in communities of color, so it presents fertile ground for advancing anti-racist action around energy while reinvigorating communal ties in the places most disrupted by COVID. At the same time, the energy democracy movement enthusiastically supports solar and wind technologies, so it's not immune to the techno-fetishism that Planet critiques. Specifically, energy democracy campaigns for solar energy in low-income Black and Latinx communities unwittingly contribute to some of the acute environmental problems sensationalized by the film, namely extractive mining and industry, toxic dumping, occupational health hazards, and decommissioning problems. In the process, these anti-racist campaigns paradoxically reinforce the white supremacist hierarchies inherent to most commodity production, because communities of color are disproportionately impacted by extraction and waste disposal on both ends of capitalist supply chains. So today, I'm going to address this conundrum by offering a grassroots solar campaign praxis for better aligning community solar campaigns with anti-racist energy democracy principles focused on solar energy supply chains, linkages that can help communities of color rebuild after COVID. But before I get into the praxis, I'm going to explain why we should connect anti-racist work with work to improve solar energy supply chains. And toward this end, I'm going to first situate the anti-solar critiques of Moore's Planet film in the era of Black Lives Matter, or BLM. Because broadly speaking, the YouTube release of Planet and the resurgence of BLM this spring had similar motivations. Both were rooted in a desire to expose Americans to unpleasant realities that have too long been ignored and minimized, namely institutional racism and extractivism of clean energy industries. Both therefore challenge entrenched myths of progress in the US, demonstrating that our recent past was not as just as many contend it was, and that our future likely won't be as sustainable as many contend it will be. But their respective approaches to demystifying the status quo couldn't be further apart, because one focuses on structural power and one doesn't. Specifically, Planet attempts to demystify the status quo through a polemical narrative that hyperbolically magnifies the limitations of renewable energy production. For instance, it suggests that one of the most dangerous things right now is the illusion that alternative technologies like solar are somehow different from fossil fuels, because extractive and fossil fuel industries are a part of solar supply chains. Now, to suggest that solar is not different from fossil fuels or is frankly lunacy, and many of the film's more specific claims are similarly completely nuts. But almost all of these claims are rooted in some degree of reality, because when we look closely at solar, we see that solar doesn't actually abide by our utopic ideals. Solar is often made with toxic chemicals like silicon tetrachloride and cadmium, plastics made from fossil fuels, deplorable labor conditions, primarily in China, where most indigent workers' communities are poisoned by the pollution from solar manufacturing plants, or here in the US, where federal prisoners manufacture panels for essentially no wages. Solar panels also generate e-waste when they're decommissioned. And e-waste, as we know, disproportionately burdens global South communities and other poor communities of color. So the film's critiques of solar's extractive nature are not unwarranted. And to the contrary, they're quite important, because they rightly aim to snap us out of the illusion that everything is going to be fine if we can somehow switch to solar. But to suggest that solar and fossil fuels are basically the same is not simply to overlook their vastly different benefits and burdens related to carbon and extraction, or even the different benefits and burdens among many different types of solar infrastructure, such as rooftop PV, solar farms, and concentrated solar power. The film's failure to differentiate benefits and burdens also and most crucially overlooks the question of who benefits and whose burden. And this question of who benefits and whose burden must be at the core of any effort to transform how we power society. Because on the one hand, the economic and environmental impacts of renewable energy are significantly better for many poor communities of color than those of fossil fuels. Yet, on the other hand, renewables can't be extricated from systems of class and race inequality that oppress those same communities. Yet the film's failure to attend to the race and class power dynamics of our energy infrastructures opens the door to its Neo-Malthusian critique. Because when we don't examine how these power dynamics determine who benefits and who's burdened from solar and fossil fuels, it's easy to believe that all humans are responsible for our energy system's problems. The film's race and class blind analysis distributes culpability to all humans equally, as its title suggests. BLM offers a corrective to this decontextualized mode of analysis, bringing to light the structural roots of long-standing under-acknowledged problems. To understand why, let's consider the role of visual media in both Planet and in BLM activism. Both Planet and BLM are affectively grounded in the dissemination of outrageous video footage. Planet centers its analysis on alarming videos of environmentally destructive renewable energy production, while this moment's BLM activism was largely activated by the horrific 8-minute video of the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, a reckless white cop. But while Planet sensationalizes this footage by failing to situate it in a structural context, BLM explicitly contextualizes the video, linking it to a broader structure of systemic racism that we can locate not merely in extreme acts of anti-Black physical violence, but also in everyday media representations of Black people, anti-Black microaggressions, and quotidian feelings of precarity in Black communities. BLM therefore demonstrates that racism is not always sensational and overt. It is often insidious and complex. And through such a holistic orientation to the world, BLM situates anti-Black violence in a broader system of racial capitalism, a term coined by a Black scholar, Cedric Robinson, to call attention to the ways in which racism is and always has been a structuring logic of capitalism. Robinson analyzed the long history of capitalism to expose how it relies on racializing hierarchies to organize society around exploitative and extractive values. And this concept informs BLM's structural analysis. Instead of disseminating decontextualized sensational footage, as Planet does, we can better confront the problems with renewable energy production by adopting BLM's approach and examining the complexities and insidiousness of an extractive, exploitative structure of power rooted in racial capitalism. Broadly speaking, this would entail recognizing that the use of elements, minerals, and other extractive materials in renewable energy supply chains is not always as violent as Planet suggests it is, yet such production is part of an insidious, complex structure of extraction that protects the environmental and economic well-being of some humans at the expense of others. A landscape of production that always exploits poor communities in mining and manufacturing zones in both the global north and global south. When we contextualize renewable energy in this way, we recognize that its limitations do not point to a pathological condition endemic to humanity, as the film contends, but rather that these limitations are directly attributable to a system of power that privileges consumers and businesses in predominantly rich and white countries over communities that have historically provided the labor and resources for commodity production. This, in turn, demands that we address these limitations not through Neo-Malthusian dogma, but through the sort of anti-racist activism that BLM catalyzed, activism that situates structural problems in analysis of racial capitalism. The emergent energy democracy movement is a great starting point for linking BLM's anti-racist analysis with efforts to transform our energy system. Energy democracy shares BLM's understanding of racial capitalism as it engages in grassroots organizing to equitably transform energy infrastructures in low-income communities of color that are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. It also works to generate high-quality jobs in the renewable energy sector in those communities. And it works to shift energy governance from investor-owned utilities to accountable, publicly controlled institutions. While this focus on structural power is obviously at odds with Planet's Neo-Malthusianism, both the film's analysis and that of the energy democracy movement challenge a prominent binary in climate mitigation discourse: bad fossil fuels versus good renewables. Instead of uncritically embracing renewables as the polar opposite of fossil fuels, energy democracy activists contend that a transition to renewables without an explicit equity agenda can maintain the structures of capitalist and white supremacist exploitation that undergird the fossil fuel economy. In particular, these activists caution against a renewable-powered world where electricity continues to be controlled by unaccountable utilities who focus on maximizing profits on the backs of communities of color, where fossil fuel corporations invest in industrial-scale solar and wind farms, displacing indigenous nations to power their own operations, and where marginalized people continue to supply undervalued labor to the energy generation industry and see none of its financial benefits. But in challenging the fossil fuel versus renewable binary, the energy democracy movement often constructs a different binary, one that Moore's film flatly rejects. We can characterize this binary as the extractive economy versus the regenerative economy, illustrated in this graph here, which was developed by energy democracy activists. This graphic counterposes many pillars of what it classifies as an extractive economy, including, the military-industrial complex, consumerism, and for-profit extraction, with many pillars of what it classifies as a regenerative economy, including deep democracy, racial justice, and ecological and social well-being. In the process, it suggests that these visions are fundamentally incompatible, calling for a societal transition where the latter supplants the former. Energy democracy activists suggest that this binary offers moral clarity as they work to move beyond the violence of racial capitalism. Yet, these activists undercut this extractive regenerative binary when they undertake the important work of actually facilitating energy transitions in communities of color, because this work demands that they focus dogmatically on reducing renewable energy prices, which unwittingly enfolds the capitalist practices of the extractive economy into the work for the regenerative economy. So I witnessed this closely when I conducted ethnographic research with an anti-racist housing rights organization in a low-income Black and Latinx community that had just pivoted to doing renewable energy work. The group initially regarded solar as a commonsensical way of making local housing more affordable because many community members lived under the threat of electricity and gas utility shutoffs. And several had actually lost heat and power due to an inability to pay their bills, a problem that's disproportionately experienced in communities of color. Additionally, most community members paid an exceptionally high percentage of their disposable income on energy, electricity, and gas. And this energy burden, as it's known, was wrapped up in the overarching problem of unmanageable housing costs in light of flat wages and financial precarity. So by reducing electricity costs, solar could, in theory, ease this burden and therefore work toward more affordable housing. The organization also realized that solar could partly liberate their poor community of color from the utility who controlled the electricity that they were dependent on, democratizing energy in the process. So they crafted a broad local energy democracy agenda committed to three things. First, securing a giant community shared solar array on a communal space that all local residents could purchase their electricity from. Second, establishing a local solar installation co-op that would provide a substantive alternative to racial capitalism through equality solar jobs, shared wealth, and communal ownership. And finally, launching a political organizing effort to democratize the traditionally inaccessible and white-run Public Utility Commission, the government agency that oversees energy utilities in their state. Achieving these long-term aspirations, however, demanded immediate-term pragmatism because solar was prohibitively expensive for most community members. So the first step for the organization was bringing down costs in the here and now. And toward this end, they launched a community solar campaign based on the Solarize model, a popular market-based approach to generating residential solar throughout the United States. Specifically, Solarize aims to dramatically reduce the cost of solar by clustering homeowners into large purchasing pools and leveraging the consumer power of these clusters to secure fixed below market rate prices for solar installations. Solarize campaigns can also generate other community investments, such as local hiring commitments made by solar installation firms. And so for these reasons, many energy democracy activists view Solarize as a means of empowering people of color who have traditionally had no control over the dirty energy that they are dependent on, enabling them to really take the lead in securing a clean energy future that works for their communities. So to launch their Solarize campaign, the organization convened a series of public meetings to inform the community about solar's benefits, focusing on the extractive versus regenerative binary that we just discussed. They called on community members to engage in grassroots canvassing and door knocking, to enlist their local friends, family, and neighbors into a large solar purchasing pool, empowering them to really negotiate competitive prices and also local job opportunities with solar installation firms. Simply put, the more community members who signed up for solar, the greater the reduction in costs and the greater the opportunities for local job creation. After these meetings, many community members were obviously very interested in going solar, and several actually committed to joining the purchasing pool, which was quite exciting. Noticeably, though, the discussions at these meetings almost never focused on the extractive regenerative binary, or more broadly, on the organization's anti-racist vision for energy democracy. Instead, community members who had been burdened by years of false promises for equitable development fixated on the price of solar, wanting to know exactly how much the campaign would reduce costs and how they could access financing to cover any remaining costs. In other words, the pragmatism of the Solarize model quickly oriented the campaign to the narrow matter of cost reductions, not long-term structural change or anti-racist action. What was supposed to be a campaign for energy democracy rooted in principles of racial and economic justice appeared to be morphing into a market-based effort to secure competitive prices for consumers. As the organization actually went about developing a purchasing pool, they put together a competitive request for proposals that they sent to local solar contractors to get specific proposals for lowering costs and also for creating jobs. But importantly, the RFP was a technocratic document that did not explicitly address the organization's broader racial and economic justice agenda. Specifically, the RFP asked contractors to propose a tiered pricing structure that incentivized a larger purchasing pool while also soliciting information on their operations, equipment, and their willingness to hire locally. In particular, the RFP solicited a considerable amount of quantitative data, requesting that contractors offer information like price per watt estimates, financing proposals, and data on the efficiency of their solar technology, among other more technical and quantitative matters. Again, eschewing the broader questions of racial and economic justice that had initially animated the campaign. 6 contractors submitted proposals with these metrics in response to their RFP, and the organization then populated a spreadsheet with these metrics and other quantitative data from the contractors' proposals, mapping their different plans to reduce the price of solar based on economies of scale. As such, the spreadsheet can be thought of what I like to call a means of reduction, that is, a way of apprehending a good or service solely in terms of its reductive capacities, enabling us to implement strategies to quantitatively reduce a negative phenomenon. By focusing grassroots campaigns on a series of metrics, the means of reduction foregrounds the narrow imperative to reduce in much broader struggles for structural change, orienting political work around the diminishment of quantitative figures, notably cost estimates. So this reorientation was on full display as the community members reviewed the spreadsheet. Instead of discussing their anti-racist vision for a regenerative economy or collective strategies to bend the racist, classist order of the extractive economy, these community members focused narrowly on comparing the spreadsheet's different figures, attempting to determine which company could most efficiently reduce the cost of solar for the community, which makes complete sense. In other words, when they deliberated to identify a contractor, the pragmatic will to reduce eclipsed all of their other political considerations. In the process, the community unwittingly reproduced the logics and practices of the extractive economy in spite of their best efforts to realize a regenerative economy. Specifically, in focusing on reducing prices, they prioritize contractors who use solar panels manufactured by companies with a poor record of worker rights, health, and safety, a poor record of reporting on their supply chains and their panels' toxicity, and a mediocre record of using energy and generating greenhouse gas emissions in their operations, according to data from the Silicon Valley Toxic Coalition. In this way, the RFP process exemplified the selective environmentalist ethic that the Planet film critiques. That is, the tendency of solar advocates to overlook the waste, chemicals, neocolonial exploitation, and energy-intensive infrastructures plaguing communities of color on the back end of solar supply chains. In other words, when we apprehend solar in terms of the means of reduction, we overlook solar's means of production, including the factories, raw materials, machinery, and infrastructure of solar supply chains. The Solarize model then obfuscates the racialized labor conditions, dearth of worker rights, geographical inequalities, environmental injustices, and white supremacist division of labor that give form to supply chains of technological commodities, including solar. Put differently, the premium on reduction in Solarize campaigns in low-income communities of color in the global north detracts from a broader anti-racist framework that values the lives and livelihoods of peoples and ecosystems in exploited sacrifice zones, largely in the global south. Privileging the means of reduction over the means of production, the community members proceeded to assign scores to each of the contractors' proposals based on a rubric that linked numeric ratings to the proposal's various metrics, creating an impartial baseline for adjudicating the contractor's reductive capacities. And when it was all said and done, the contractor who proposed to use solar panels manufactured under the worst conditions of racial capitalism got the highest score and won a contract to implement solar in the community. In attempting to pragmatically launch a regenerative economy, the community unwittingly took part in the extractive economy, troubling the binary that informs anti-racist energy democracy work. How then can marginalized communities work for anti-racist energy democracy if the solar infrastructure of the regenerative economy is contingent on the racial capitalism of the extractive economy? One way of tending to this conundrum is shifting the emphasis of community solar campaigns from the means of reduction to the means of production. Toward this end, I'm now going to propose a new community solar praxis committed to racial justice at all points of the solar supply chain, and not just at spaces of consumption. This praxis consists of a conceptual framework focused on co-pollutants, and 3 pragmatic practices for operationalizing this framework. So I'll now break this down, starting with the co-pollutant framework, a framework focused on recognition. If we want to deploy solar in low-income communities of color to secure environmental justice, we must first recognize that all forms of industrialized energy, including solar, have corrosive repercussions that disproportionately affect communities of color. One way that we can actually recognize such harms is through the EJ concept, the environmental justice concept of co-pollutants. This concept calls attention to the ways in which energy generation and other industrial practices simultaneously generate greenhouse gases and pollutants such as nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. In labeling such pollutants co-pollutants, scholars highlight how the fossil fuel infrastructures that significantly contribute to climate change also contribute to public health problems that disproportionately impact poor communities of color. But crucially, analyses of co-pollutants highlight the ways in which some strategies to reduce greenhouse gases only marginally reduce environmental hazards in communities of color, and inversely, the ways in which other strategies simultaneously significantly address environmental injustices, because there's not an identical correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants across different industrial sectors, meaning that some efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions more effectively mitigate co-pollutants than others. As such, an EJ approach, that is an environmental justice approach to climate mitigation, explicitly prioritizes strategies that optimally address co-pollutants. We can apply this EJ approach to renewable energy infrastructures and Solarize campaigns in particular. Just as consumption of fossil fuels generates nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, the production of solar utilizes silicon tetrachloride, hydrofluoric acid, cadmium, and other toxins that disproportionately harm poor communities of color. We can conceptualize these hazards as the co-pollutants of the minimal greenhouse gas emissions generated by solar production. And with this in mind, anti-racist solar campaigns can move beyond the narrow focus of reducing electricity bills and greenhouse gas emissions by addressing environmental injustices through strategies that reduce co-pollutants across the entire supply chain, which is to say that a shift to co-pollutants calls on us to not merely reduce a single metric of harm, but rather to attenuate multiple metrics of harm across communities of color at every point of supply chains. We can then pragmatically incorporate the co-pollutant framework into Solarize campaigns by transforming how we actually go about leveraging economies of scale. This can entail three things. First, this entails shifting the campaign focus from consumer power to people power. Second, this entails broadening Solarize purchasing pools in ways that actually reflect this shift. And finally, this entails working toward what I like to think of as supply chain solidarity between communities of color that produce solar infrastructure and communities of color that consume such infrastructure. So I'll now lay out these three interventions. And let's first start with shifting the focus from consumer power to people power, which frankly is the most basic of the three interventions. Now, as we've discussed, the formation of large purchasing pools is a fairly pragmatic way of overcoming marginalized communities' financial barriers to going solar. But this rationale solidifies consumer market logics that suggest that social transformation and material well-being are best secured through quantifiable interventions grounded in market rationalities, and therefore divorced from so-called irrational social structures like white supremacy and colonialism. The co-pollutant framework troubles this logic by exposing the ways in which a premium on consumer price reductions in poor communities of color in the global north can contribute to the generation of toxins in poor communities of color in the global south, fomenting long-standing environmental injustices. So with this in mind, the first step to actually incorporating a co-pollutants framework into a Solarize campaign is to very simply acknowledge that any effort to achieve economies of scale in the energy sector necessarily reproduces extractive and exploitative systems as evinced by the distribution of co-pollutants. This acknowledgement can take the form of a Solarize campaign mission statement, a formal declaration at campaign meetings, or a written theory of change that campaign organizers develop and use. So with this very basic acknowledgement in place, campaign organizers can then begin to shift their campaign's economies of scale approach from consumer power to people power. Instead of focusing, and specifically what this looks like is instead of focusing on generating a broad pool of consumers who leverage their purchasing power through cost reductions, campaigns could focus on generating a critical mass of people who leverage their collective power to create a regenerative economy that works to limit co-pollutants in all communities, including those in the crosshairs of industrial production in China. Such a shift in focus could also take shape through a campaign mission statement, the articulation of goals at campaign meetings, or also a written theory of change. And with this sort of formal articulation in place, we can then actually begin to pursue strategies to address co-pollutants in Solarize campaigns, which brings me to my second intervention, broadening Solarize purchasing pools. So once Solarize campaigns commit to shifting from a narrow vision of consumer power to a broader vision of people power, they can operationalize this commitment by expanding their purchasing pools from the local level to the citywide or regional level, focusing their efforts on mass movement building. This would entail rejecting a narrow organizing ethos focused on targeting individual consumers in a particular geographic market, and instead generating a broad-based organizing effort centered on communities of color working in solidarity with one another. Expansive regional purchasing pools committed to anti-racism could really begin to work toward this goal by better leveraging the power of marginalized communities to minimize co-pollutants by demanding concessions of industry that go way beyond simple price reductions. Specifically, community groups, houses of worship, and other local institutions in contiguous communities of color across local borders on a regional scale can begin to cooperate on larger Solarize campaigns that pledge to target wider swaths of homes and buildings for solar installations at fixed tier pricing. These partnerships could then collaboratively issue requests for proposals for accredited solar contractors to install multiple megawatts of residential solar across multiple properties regionally. A campaign that pledges to reach that sort of scale through tiered pricing proposals in the residential sector would represent a level of consumer demand far greater than what most residential installers, solar installers, are accustomed to for single solar installation initiatives and projects. As such, the sheer scale has the potential to give energy democracy activists a level of leverage in incentivizing or even demanding social equity and supply chain transparency from contractors, including certain high-quality labor credentials, supply chain monitoring, high-end procurement, and codified commitments to anti-racist business practices that could collectively minimize co-pollutants. At the most rudimentary level, this could entail including really basic contractor prerequisites in a citywide or regional Solarize RFP. Such an RFP could, for instance, require that all contractors who submit a proposal source their products from companies that adhere to the Solar Energy Industry Association's Solar Industry Environmental and Social Responsibility Commitment, or similar standards that are not necessarily particular to the solar industry, such as SGS's internationally recognized verifications and certifications. Contractors who adhere to these really, really basic sourcing standards and actually go about submitting a proposal could then be screened according to a point system that rewards contractors that ethically and vigilantly monitor their procurement and supply chain practices. Currently, Solarize RFPs evaluate contractors' proposed pricing, system design, quality of equipment and products, implementation plan, and commitment to workforce training or hiring. Quality of equipment and products, though, focuses narrowly on solar panel efficiency, panel warranty, inverter warranty, and workmanship warranty. An expanded Solarize campaign with more leverage could introduce other markers of product quality to minimize co-pollutants, such as the use of recycled materials or of minimal toxic heavy metals or less noxious alternatives like zinc sulfide, or the documenting of labor, environmental, and human rights screenings of solar supply chains. In addition to quality of products, other standards could be put in place following the Silicon Valley Toxic Coalition Solar Scorecard, whereby contractors could get points in the Solarize evaluation process for sourcing from companies that abstain from sourcing products from conflict minerals or for participating in a recycling or take-back program, for instance. Now, these rather basic innovations to the Solarize RFP process cannot definitively adjudicate claims of quality and compliance or definitively raise the industry standards of transparency. Instead, they represent a starting point for a much more robust process of leveraging economies of scale to minimize co-pollutants through Solarize campaigns. The next step to incorporating a co-pollutants framework into these campaigns is to make common cause with communities and workers of color burdened by co-pollutants on the back end of solar supply chains. This could entail both reviewing reports and research on the workplace hazards of solar manufacturing, and also forming alliances with activists and workers in the various industries that manufacture solar infrastructure to better identify their burdens and demands. For instance, Black and Latinx EJ activists in the global north can reach out to transnational organizations like China Labor Watch and China Labor Bulletin, which support worker activists in China's sprawling manufacturing sector. And they could do so specifically to try to understand the unique harms that workers on the ground are facing, and to also identify improvements that can minimize co-pollutants and thereby improve worker and community safety on the back end of solar supply chains. Connecting with such organizations could also enable EJ activists to foster alliances with on-the-ground workers and deepen their visions for an anti-racist regenerative economy. Activists could then draw from such alliances and information collection to develop standards for reducing co-pollutants through the expanded Solarize purchasing pools that I just proposed. As W.E.B. Du Bois argued, anti-Black racism has always been entangled with the racialized subjugation of workers in Asia and in other colonized people all over the world. So making common cause with such workers in the solar industry is an important step to actually incorporating anti-racist practices aligned with BLM in efforts to transform our energy infrastructures. Now, to be short, the proposed community solar practice that I just laid out could not by itself eliminate co-pollutants across solar supply chains or realize a regenerative economy completely outside the bounds of racial capitalism or the extractive economy. But in orienting Solarize campaigns away from a single metric of reduction and toward a moral reckoning with production, this praxis's focus on co-pollutants can address the problems that Planet polemically highlights in ways that are aligned with BLM structural analysis. In the process, this praxis can empower activists and communities of color to begin the really complicated work of linking racial and environmental justice struggles at prolific sites of energy consumption with racial and environmental justice struggles at prolific sites of solar infrastructure production. If existing Solarize campaigns have taught us anything about community power, it's that when people of color besieged by environmental injustices come together to create a groundswell of activity in a nascent industry, they can begin to demand of private corporations certain provisions that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten. Magnifying this purchasing power by focusing less on mobilizing consumers to reduce costs and more on mobilizing a critical mass of marginalized people to equitably transform infrastructure can lay the foundation for a much broader movement to democratize energy in ways that include all communities of color. Such organizing linkages must be an integral component of life in the post-COVID era. For the pandemic has exposed the depths of our interconnections with one another, the ways in which our environments, our health systems, our social stratifications, our commodity markets, and our geopolitics are intimately intertwined. The pandemic's racial impacts underscore these interconnections. After all, COVID-19 has both exacerbated trenchant racial inequalities in every facet of modern society and contributed significantly to the emotional and material conditions that proliferated anti-racist activism in the US and across the globe in unprecedented ways. Furthermore, like all pandemics, COVID-19 was largely shaped by a system of extraction in the form of industrialized agriculture, domesticated animals, and urbanization that alienates modern people from the means of production on which our lives depend. As such, now more than ever, it's crucial that anti-racist work is linked to effort to upend those systems of extraction, especially as the pandemic's impacts represent a chilling crystallization of the sort of dislocations that fossil-fueled climate change is also causing in communities of color, such as loss of livelihood, exacerbated health problems, food apartheid, among many other things. Put differently, both COVID-19 and climate change are biopolitical transformations that heighten the precarity of communities of color. So we must center anti-racist work in any effort to address the structural roots of those transformations. As Planet of the Humans points out, such an effort cannot entail an uncritical valorization of technological commodities, and the energy democracy movement is well equipped to actually act on this idea in alignment with the anti-racist imperatives of this present moment. The praxis that I propose can facilitate such an alignment, connecting the dots between theory and practice in a warming, pandemic-stricken world that has eviscerated any sense that our movements can ever operate in isolation of one another. Thank you very much. So, thank you for listening to my lengthy spiel, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with your questions and ideas and having a little dialogue.
Myles, thank you so much for that extraordinarily thoughtful and impassioned talk, and I'm so grateful that you were able to share your ideas with us. We've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. There seems to be a lot of different topics there. So if you'd like, you can start with some of them.
Sure. So I guess I'll just start with Colin Miller's question. What organization did you work with in the case study you're describing? So I'm an anthropologist, and it's quite important for me to keep my informants' identities anonymous. That's part of the agreement. They give me access to every facet of their operations, and my job is not to sort of air their dirty laundry or to even give them promotional praise, but to instead try to draw lessons learned and to present them in the kind of format that I did today. So for that reason, I'm unable to share, but this is an environmental justice organization that traditionally has worked on affordable housing in Black communities in New York City, and has recently pivoted to doing solar work, as they see that as being very aligned with their affordable housing organizing. I will. I guess I will go in chronological order right now, but I see, Colin, you have another question. So are you studying community choice aggregation programs in relation to aggregated regional or municipal solar procurement? What is your observation about the potential of electrician IBEW labor unions in being allies rather than opponents, potentially in league with utilities in some cases, for such an aggregated solar installation model to achieve economies of scale for community-owned solar? That's a great question, Colin. I really appreciate that. Yes, I am looking at community choice aggregation and other community shared solar models. The short answer is, when you're talking about specifically about IBEW, you're talking about a very variegated political and economic landscape. While IBEW and other big labor unions affiliated with the AFL-CIO are international unions, their politics and their sort of orientation to other actors in the areas where they work looks very differently depending on what region and what market that you're looking at. And so there are places where in New York City there is a very strong there are very strong coalitions between the local three, the IBEW local chapter there, and environmental justice and community-based organizations, largely because New York City is still very much a union town, and a good chunk of large-scale construction work is still done union. And so there's less antagonism, and there's a recognition that community and labor need to work hand in hand. to ensure that we are transitioning to a high road green collar economy with good jobs and opportunities for employment and benefits and safety and workplace safety. In other areas, though, unions and IBEW have been very much pitted against community groups on the grounds that the union and sometimes has traditionally been hostile to taking in workers of color. Often they demand wages and provisions that make things prohibitively expensive for doing affordable housing work in certain markets where there's not the financial infrastructure in place to subsidize affordable housing. There are myriad kinds of debates and different kinds of relationships between community groups and unions, depending on where you look. I think that, but to try to answer your question specifically, when you're talking on the scale of community choice aggregation or just any approach that tries to look at rooftop solar in a way that's focused on creating economies of scale, there is, I think, always the potential to leverage those economies of scale towards good paying jobs and towards jobs that therefore go union. I definitely think there is a potential for those kinds of collaborations, but still the residential solar market, even in a place like New York City, is overwhelmingly non-union. Union wage structures are not aligned with a good chunk of the residential solar market. I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I think in the ideal world, the residential market would be structured and subsidized in a way that union wages were commonplace. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So to try to think specifically to your point, Colin, I mean, I think there's really a real opportunity with community choice aggregation, or again, any program that's focused on leveraging economies of scale to try to build that solidarity between labor unions and community groups in a way that recognizes that when we lift all, whatever, I can't remember what that phrase is, it's been too long of a day, but when we put in high road standards, that helps everybody. And unfortunately, focus on reducing costs often comes at odds with high labor standards. And I think we need to get beyond that sort of reduction-oriented mentality that I discussed in my presentation, explicitly to try to reach, to create solidarity and alignment between unions and community groups. Okay, I will move to Anjali. I'm curious to know if there are good models out there for a shift to regenerative economy, e.g. have countries that are much further along in a shift to renewables than the US, like say Germany, done a better job in any way. You know, in terms of Germany, so I only focus on the United States. I have a very limited knowledge and understanding of the German renewable energy transition. Obviously, we know Germany is in many respects, a model for transition to wind and solar. But the little that I do know is that German markets do, in fact, procure a good chunk, on the residential side at least, do procure a good chunk of their solar technologies from the same big firms that supply most of the US market, most of which are making their panels in factories in China under variable labor conditions. So based on my sort of cursory knowledge of the German solar market, with again the caveat that I'm not in the least bit an expert there, I would imagine that while they have obviously, while they're obviously a leader in efficiently transitioning and really leveraging the power of the government to create a robust renewable energy market, I know of nothing in that transition that really focuses on trying to reduce co-pollutants, whether explicitly or implicitly, through high labor procurement standards, or sorry, high product procurement standards, that's looking very closely at where they're sourcing their panels from, or rather the conditions under which the panels that they're sourcing are manufactured. So I don't know if Germany is a sort of paradigm for the kind of regenerative economy that I'm talking about, that doesn't simply look at how do we transform on the consumption end of renewable energy infrastructure, but also on the production end. I think though, So let's think, are there good models out there? I mean, I think that very generally speaking, there are numerous mutual aid and cooperative economies that have been organized by communities of color, by indigenous communities for time immemorial, that sort of demonstrate what can happen when people come together to share resources, share labor, and to do so in a way that's mindful of all of the inputs and all of the labor that goes into making the things and the resources that we need to survive. Often we don't necessarily think about mutual aid or cooperative economies as being a blueprint for setting up a renewable energy market. But if there ever was a so-called model for regenerative economy, that's where I'd look. And there are no shortage of examples there are no shortage of examples out there about mutual aid economies, cooperative economies. But my hope, though, is that the praxis that I laid out today is a blueprint for a kind of model for regenerative economy, one that really looks again at all points of the supply chain, tries to build solidarity between people both consuming and producing, and that recognizes that there are better ways of making and using technology. And just to close on this point, while I wouldn't call it a model, there are numerous sourcing practices that the solar energy industry does engage in that's better than other practices that the industry also engages in. No two solar products are alike. No two solar manufacturing companies are alike. And when we get into the weeds and actually compare different products, we see that it is in fact possible to create quality products, or at least products that minimize co-pollutants. And a good example is in the solar energy industry about a decade ago, most, or actually I don't want to say most, but I think most, but that's just anecdotal. I want to say most solar panels were made in factories that use sulfur hexafluoride. And sulfur hexafluoride is the most potent greenhouse gas, 25,000 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. And those manufacturing plants were using it on the reactors that they use in their operations. And that was just so crazy. Solar panels that were supposed to be bringing down our greenhouse gas emissions were emitting sulfur hexafluoride. Well, the industry cleaned up its act, and now that is a far less common practice. Most of the solar products that we're consuming today do not use sulfur hexafluoride, which is great. Which is to say that that there are a number of best practices for making solar more sustainable and more aligned with the principles of regenerative economy that I just laid out. And so our task is to try to intervene in the market and the dominant organization of how we procure and use solar in a way that prioritizes those good practices. And that strikes me, while there's not a model for that per se, that strikes me as a very plausible thing. I will shift to, and I apologize if I'm going to get your name wrong or pronounce it incorrectly, but Tesfayonis Jakob. What can federal government agencies do in regulations or incentives to help with democratizing energy in the solar field? For starters, federal government can get a better leader, but we'll try to keep politics out of this, especially just a few more days of the election. In terms of democratizing energy, I mean, it depends on what we think of as democratizing energy. Often when I think of democratizing energy, it's not simply a matter of ensuring that there's greater access to renewable energy commodities and services in places that have traditionally been burdened by a fossil fuel economy, but also that regular people have a stake or rather have a say and have power in determining how their energy is governed. And most states, I think, including California, you have your Public Utility Commission or your Public Service Commission, and these are, while they are, nominally part of our democratic system of governance, in fact, they are extremely opaque institutions that most citizens know nothing about. They do hearings and participatory forums that are entirely inaccessible. They use jargon that no lay people know. And as a result, most people have no knowledge of the governing bodies that have been entrusted to oversee our energy generation system by our so-called democracy. And so democratizing energy, to me, I think, at its most core, must mean empowering people to actually play a role in those governance bodies. And to me, I don't think, so while the federal government is capable of doing things like passing a renewable energy tax credit and specifically putting in provisions in a tax credit that provide greater support to poor communities or communities of color, or they're capable of developing large block grant programs that focus on transitioning and building renewable energy infrastructures in communities that currently house fossil fuel infrastructure. There are normal sort of big investments that the federal government can and hopefully will make in renewable energy. We saw this at a very minuscule level with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus in 2009, and hopefully we'll be seeing a much bigger one in 2021 that does similar things, but on a much broader scale. But if we really want to look to democratize energy, I think we can't look to the federal government, although the federal government has a really important role to play in transitioning our energy infrastructures in an equitable way. Democratizing energy, I think, needs to take the role of community groups on the ground, organizing people, people learning about what the public utility commissions do, disrupting the public utility commissions, demanding greater accountability on the state level of public utility commissions and other unaccountable investor-owned utilities that govern the energy that we depend on to survive. And the good news is more increasingly, especially over the last 5 years, there have been a ton of community groups that get it, that are learning about public utility commissions, that are learning about these unaccountable investor-owned utilities, and are actually beginning to storm the gates, calling their legislators, creating a groundswell of organizing to create that sort of change, to actually democratize the way that energy is governed. And to me, I hope the feds invest heavily in renewables and communities of color, but to actually democratize energy, that work, I think, needs to start on the ground. I will move to an anonymous attendee. You mentioned common cause and moral reckoning. It is so hard to convince anyone that they should have compassion for people they will never meet, especially when they themselves are being victimized and exploited by upper-class capitalists. In order to convince people that there is serious harm happening to families that they will never meet, just so they can have lower energy costs, it may be necessary to show them the actual humans that are being harmed, their children and grandparents and their stories. Might it be feasible to connect the peoples harmed by production with the peoples harmed by high energy costs, so that people on this end will be easier convinced to join a particular kind of energy activism? That is not just organizations, but also real people with translators to help the communication. Anonymous attendee, I couldn't agree more. I think that what you lay out is really key. Part of what's so insidious about energy is, as I'm sure everyone here knows, when it takes the form of an industrialized commodity, it's something that we never see, that we as consumers, especially those of us who don't live next to a fossil fuel power plant, it's something that we don't see or touch or hear. While it's an incredibly present part of our material day to day, it's still grounded in all kinds of abstractions, especially when we know it primarily through our energy bills. And as such, it's very easy to disentangle energy from the real human society and social consequences that make that energy possible. And so by all means, any effort to demystify production and show the real human faces, the real human suffering, and to specifically do so in a way to create common cause, I think is absolutely key. So I couldn't agree more with your comment. Colin, you have a number of questions. I'm going to skip over that one just because I've touched base with it. I've responded to a couple of them. So I'm going to go to, I'll go back to that one, but I'm going to go to Alina. The newest term, intersectional environmentalism, that has been born out of the relationship between BLM and environmental advocates, has brought this interlinking into the light of social media today. Do you feel that intersectional environmentalism can be a way to change and support the energy democracy movement? Yeah, I mean, I see the energy democracy movement as being a form of intersectional environmentalism, or rather to be really led by intersectional environmentalists. And intersection, just to be clear, intersectionality is a increasingly prominent term that that its specific meaning often gets misconstrued in, or has been misconstrued in, the proliferation of it as a term. And so it specifically refers to a strand of Black feminism that calls attention to how Black women experience institutional misogyny and sexism and structural racism in intersecting ways. We can never disentangle them. And while we can apply an intersectional lens to all kinds of facets of oppression, it's also important to ground our understanding of intersectionality in the specific Black feminist tradition, and in recognizing that it at its core is a Black feminist analytic. And just in that vein, it's worth noting that most EJ activism is led by Black women and women of color. It's precisely those women who pioneered and promulgated intersectionality as an increasingly commonplace frame for understanding structural oppression today. And so, it's always been quite encouraging. The energy democracy movement has really been led by people of color, women of color and Black women. And I think that when you actually look at that organizing on the ground, you often see an intersectional analysis, and that is really key to your point, Alina. Okay, I'm going to move to Lena. How do we overcome what seems like a catch-22 for poor communities of color? That is the now concern that limits future-based decision-making, the financial pressures that make cost consideration a huge part of this decision in all aspects of life, make it hard to envision a sacrifice in this for what could be seen as a future theoretical benefit. I see your point, Lena, and it always is a struggle to try to just follow on the previous comments and questions. It is a struggle to call attention to how different structures of oppression are intersecting, and therefore to really impress upon people who are facing really dogged challenges in the here and now, the importance of trying to address those challenges in a way that's also mindful of other people who are also facing challenges in the here and now. That is always a challenge. But I think that more times than not, especially, at least this is what I found in my research in communities of color and reflecting on the communities that I'm from and have been a part of for my life, more times than not, people who are facing structural oppression understand and are able to see structural oppression in other settings. And while that doesn't mean that they'll necessarily entirely backburner their concerns in the interest of supporting someone else, what that does mean, I think, more times than not, is that they'll be willing to forge an agenda for fighting these systems in tandem with one another. It is not, I don't think it's that hard to impress upon people the reality that whatever things that someone is facing today, the difficulty in paying your electricity bills, the fear of a shutoff tomorrow, the challenges with housing, whatever immediate term concerns one has, I don't think it's hard to make the linkage between people suffering under similar but different conditions of precarity in other places, and to also make the case that those sufferings go hand in hand. And I don't think it's hard to make that case to people, and I think that a lot of people suffering under those systems recognize that and have that analysis. And often it's less so a matter of trying to help people see the light or help people to not be so small-minded and focus on themselves, and more a matter of simply creating the space to articulate an analysis of structural oppression. Because when you give people the space to articulate an analysis of structural oppression, when you give people a space that says, a space and a language that says that my struggle is connected with your struggle, that's people revel in that space. People very effortlessly embrace that language. It's simply a matter of creating the space to be thinking in this way, not a matter of, or rather creating the space to be framing things in this way, not a matter of changing minds. So in my mind, I don't necessarily see it as a catch-22. It is certainly a challenge. It's not easy. There certainly will be people out there who say, look, I have my day-to-day concerns. I'm worried about paying the bills right now, and I really don't have time to think about what's going on in China. And that's entirely valid and real. And I think at the same time, there are tons of people who wouldn't necessarily see that as a catch-22, who can recognize that we can be transitioning our energy infrastructure and doing so in a way that is aligned with principles of justice and fairness. But I invite also others. We have limited time now, but if other people here have different thoughts, if you might have evidence that suggests otherwise, I'm happy to talk through this, because this is a really important question you bring up, Lena. I'm going to go to Caitlin here. So I appreciated that you discussed the way solar production has also dispossessed and harmed indigenous territories. My question is, how has energy democracy discourse and activism grappled with decolonization land return? Yeah, that's a great question, Caitlin. So I don't want to speak on behalf of all energy democracy activists. I would say, at least in my experience in New York City, energy democracy activists tend to have a pretty astute analysis of settler colonialism. They want to be working in solidarity with indigenous communities. And in many instances, there are indigenous communities at the table organizing. But the pragmatics of trying to deal with land grabs on the production side of renewable energy, let alone to be in solidarity with communities that are being displaced in the interest of building a solar farm. Often that does frankly get pushed by the wayside when the focus is on, how do we make sure that we can get this piece of legislation passed that is going to invest heavily in our communities. Which is not to say that energy democracy activists are hostile or indifferent to an indigenous land, a concern with indigenous land. And I think all the activists that I know very much affirm their intent to be in solidarity with indigenous nations. But that doesn't necessarily always infuse the agenda. And I don't think it's a heavy lift, though, to try to make that shift, because there already is a receptivity. Instances where there is, though, I think, an acknowledgement of indigenous land dispossession is around hydro. And numerous energy democracy activists that I know are quite aware of how much of our hydro infrastructure is either occupying indigenous lands and or was built directly by the displacement of indigenous lands. Many proposals to expand our hydro infrastructure are at odds with the lives and livelihoods of indigenous nations. And certainly in New York, and the entire Northeast United States, we get a good chunk of our electricity from hydro, and what counts as renewable energy in the Northeast is largely hydro from Quebec on indigenous lands. And there is a real understanding of that among energy democracy activists in the Northeast. And there is also a recognition that they will not fight for hydro, and certainly not many of the plans for hydro, precisely because that will displace and work against indigenous nations. So there is the beginning of some kinds of solidarity, and certainly a good deal of consciousness, but I think opportunities for greater movement on that front. Okay, I'm going to move to Haley. What are ways that communities are working together toward solar community projects? I'm assuming the question is, how are different communities working together? There are a ton of models out there for how individual communities are working together. And if that was what you referred to, look at all kinds of examples around community shared solar. And also more generally, the Solarize model that I referenced. There are communities all over this country that are mobilizing houses of worship and schools and community centers and everyday residents to come together to aggregate their homes and buildings into giant purchasing pools to bring down the cost of solar, and to also develop what's called community shared solar and virtual net metering, where people who are unable to, for numerous reasons, put a solar panel on their own roof can still pay into and reap the financial benefits of a transition to renewable energy through a shared solar array, large-scale solar array that many community members can buy into. And that model is called community shared solar. And I recommend that you check that out if you're interested in examples for how communities can work together around solar. But in terms of how multiple communities, different communities, are working together around solar agenda, often I see less of that, which is partly why I propose the sort of expanded Solarize model that I laid out in my talk today. I think there's a real opportunity for not simply people within one community, but multiple communities to be coming together, recognizing they got common cause, and working to bring down those costs in a way that demand more social justice benefits from private sector contractors. And that's my hope for where energy democracy activism moves going forward. I'm going to go to Jared here. In terms of the green energy, do you believe that solar should be the primary development focus of the US, or should another all green technologies be developed? So Jared, I think that we should at all times eschew any kinds of panacea, any kind of thinking that says there's going to be one silver bullet that's going to save us. That's never the case. I think there always needs to be a multiple hands-on deck strategy, which does not mean nuclear or so-called clean coal or so-called natural gas. But I think that we obviously want to be looking to solar. Solar means different things too. There is, my hope in places like the United States is for rooftop solar and community shared solar and solar farms where it's not too environmentally destructive and doesn't lend itself to the displacement of people. I'm not a big supporter of concentrated solar power or CSP because those are large scale solar farms that actually run on natural gas. And you have a good chunk of them in California, and so I don't think that CSP should ever be on the table. But in addition to solar, we obviously should have wind. Geothermal is really important, and the sort of the thing that we often overlook is basic energy efficiency. There are so many ways to make our existing homes and buildings so much more efficient, and that needs to go hand in hand with any energy transition strategy. But also we need to be interrogating how we use energy. Often people are critical of campaigns that try to focus on individual consumers without looking at structures of power, and I share that critique. At the same time, while we absolutely need to be focusing on structures, and we absolutely need to be holding fossil fuels companies accountable and our elected officials who are often beholden to fossil fuel corporations accountable, and to be really focusing on large-scale systems of power, that does not preclude us from also looking at the ways that we use energy in our day-to-day lives and trying to also work towards more sustainable lives and livelihoods. And that means, though, not necessarily buying individual consumer goods or that make our homes greener, or shutting off the lights or things in that vein. That, I think, also needs to mean organizing in our communities, collectively using resources, looking to how we can stop consuming so much by sharing and working together, and not simply with an austerity model in mind, not simply with the sense like, well, we need to pathologize how we use resources. No, we can revel in the way we use resources when we use them collectively in and with our communities. And I think that that kind of cooperative community building can and needs to be a part of how we think about energy transitions as well. So the short answer is we need to be thinking expansively. We need to be thinking on multiple levels. We need to be thinking in terms of policies. We need to be thinking in terms of transforming markets and leveraging people power in transforming markets. We need to be thinking about organizing communities to use resources in more efficient ways. And we need to be looking in the mirror and looking at how we critically use energy in our day-to-day lives as well on multiple levels. I'm gonna go to Eddie here, and I guess we'll close off shortly. What are your thoughts on the roles of knowledge management in moving away from extractive industries and empowering people? Well, Eddie, knowledge and ideas are at the core of all of this. So often we think about energy transitions in terms of policies and incentives and markets and letting markets reach certain tipping points. And all of that's important, but at the core of all of this is, what is our understanding of what energy is? What's our understanding of why we use energy? And how are we developing new ways of understanding energy, of orienting ourselves to energy, of developing energy, of researching energy? All of this comes back to knowledge. And so while it's important to be thinking about technological development, it's important to be thinking about policy models, there are so many ways in which knowledge production, knowledge management, as you put it, is quite key. I guess, go for it, Deepti.
Hey, Myles, sorry to interrupt you there. We're almost close to 7 p.m. here, which is almost close to 10 p.m. where you are. And so I just want to be mindful of your time. We do have a few more questions in Q&A. Did you want to maybe just scan them and see if you can get to all of them together?
Sure. Well, actually, Deepti, had you had a chance to scan these by any chance, or?
Yeah, so there's a question from Dave that asks about, solar companies tend to be quite lean in the way they operate. So he was sort of asking about, how do you envision the money needed to bridge the gap? So that's one question. There's another question on about, having high standards for renewables. How do we think about that not conversely creating more of a push towards fossil fuel energy? Should we think about having high standards for fossil fuel supply chains as well? So there was sort of a question about, not sort of unintentionally creating renewable energy to be so prohibitive that we create a shift towards fossil fuels. And then there's, a question another question from Alina, which talks about power dynamics, within the extractive industries when solar works as extractive industry. So if you want to, you can try to address some of these, but obviously I'm very mindful of your time, so please don't feel like you have to.
Sure, thanks, Deepti. I appreciate that. I think you can touch on those. Those are all great questions. In terms of, I need to just sort of jog my memory. In terms of bringing down, right. So solar firms are often quite lean and don't necessarily have the capacity to sort of pay high road wages or to engage in the kinds of robust economic development that I propose. So the way that I'm trying to address this in this model, it's based on the Solarize model, is by leveraging economies of scale. Absolutely. The solar industry, especially on the residential side, is incredibly fragmented. A lot of small mom and pop shops out there that don't have that don't have a big or sophisticated workforce, that often has to shed workforce as a supply and demand fluctuate. These are not sophisticated or huge corporations that are, trying to pinch every penny out of their workers. These are really they're hardworking small shops that don't often have the leverage to do a lot of the great high road economy things that we want to do. And high road economy, which is a jargon term that I used to use like a decade ago. I'm unclear why it's coming out of my mouth today, but all that refers to is, quality jobs with benefits and opportunities for advancement. That's what high road economy sort of refers to. So absolutely, many of those firms don't have that capacity now, but when you give them, and that's because they're working on projects they're working on a few projects here and there that are 4, 5, 10 kilowatts here and there, and maybe their entire portfolio at every given moment is 40, 50 kilowatts at every given moment. But then next week or 2 weeks from now, that might go down to 20 kilowatts, and they have to lay off their workers. There's tremendous fluctuation. What I'm talking about is building economies of scale across communities such that the residential sector almost resembles an industrial scale or commercial scale solar. So we're talking a few megawatts. And if you offer a mom and pop shop 4, 5, 10 megawatts of work, that is scores of that's in another universe. That they're not working on that level. And when you give them that level of latitude and capital, then they have the capacity to begin hiring people at good wages. And so really the idea here is we want to leverage economies of scale, build solidarity across communities such that that those problems that small firms face with a fragmented solar market are not there to distract us from building a high road green collar economy. In terms of are solar, is there a danger of being too restrictive for solar, and potentially that just sort of helping fossil fuels? The answer to that is we need to be extremely punitive with the fossil fuel industry, and not just looking at co-pollutants and looking at and not simply sort of employing the kinds of model that I am proposing for solar, but my hope is for much more punitive, robust action with regards to fossil fuels. We need robust carbon pricing or carbon taxes that explicitly do not pass the price on to consumers through rebates, and there are all kinds of other mechanisms to ensure that a carbon tax does not end up just hurting people, just making not just end up being a regressive tax where everyday people have to pay more. We need to stop subsidies to fossil fuel companies. Obviously, we need to punish fossil fuel companies when they don't abide by environmental standards. We need stricter standards on our fossil fuel infrastructure, such like the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, which has sadly been repealed by the Trump administration. There are numerous mechanisms that we can and should and need to be employing. Obviously, we need to put a moratorium on drilling, like in the Arctic, but hopefully elsewhere. There are kinds of I think, far more robust forms of governance that I would hope to see our government employ with regard to fossil fuels of a far different magnitude than what I'm proposing that we employ for renewable energy. And I think that when you have a more punitive set of policies in place for the fossil fuel industry, the kinds of frameworks I'm proposing for the renewable energy industry would not be so detrimental. I also think, what I'm talking about here effectively is really not punishing the renewable energy industry. It is rather rewarding contractors that make an effort to look at their supply chains and to source in better ways. We know there are companies that do a better job than other companies, so let's reward the ones that are doing good. It's not, I don't think that what I propose is necessarily so punitive in any way that it would sort of give fossil fuels a leg up. And I can't remember the final question, Deepti. I know we're going over, but I'm happy to entertain one final question. So if you want to just reiterate what that question is or give me another question, let's go for that one.
Okay, so the final question is about how do we think about the power imbalances between communities of color in the context when solar power is extremely expensive as it is? How do we grapple? I think it's a sort of a broad question about how do we grapple with historic imbalances in power? And we're talking about getting communities to advocate for themselves to make solar energy more fair for them. So I'm sort of paraphrasing a bunch of comments and questions here.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I mean I think that just, to me, that underscores the imperative of doing any energy transition work in tandem with other forms of organizing. We cannot expect marginalized communities that have never had a say in the fossil fuel economy, that have been oppressed by the fossil fuel economy, to somehow just be leading the fight in its entirety for renewable energy. When people are facing childcare problems, are facing structural racism, police brutality, affordable housing problems, there are so many issues that that we need to be thinking about energy transitions in tandem with. And so I think the hope here is that the kinds of models that I'm proposing, the kinds of interventions in community shared solar organizing that I hope that we pursue, all of that needs to go in tandem with myriad other forms of organizing to address structural injustices on multiple levels, to ensure that communities that have been harmed by the fossil fuel economy and other intersecting oppressions are in a position and actually have the means to lead the fight for renewable energy economy. Thank you all so much. I wish I could get to more questions. I know my talk was quite long, but you can all feel free to be in touch with me. As Amin and Deepti will tell you, I can be quite slow to respond because we're all got a billion things on our plates. But I will respond. So if you'd like to keep up the conversation, do be in touch. And thank you so much for spending this evening with me and for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lennon, for your fantastic talk and for taking the time to present in our speaker series. I particularly appreciated your call for attention to the means of production rather than the means of reduction. And in particular, you're drawing attention to the transnational solidarities possible within the EJ work on energy transitions. I also loved how you offered both theoretical interventions and pragmatic considerations suited to a very broad audience of people from different disciplines. So thank you so much for your time and your effort in putting this talk together.
Thank you so much.
I wanted